Welcome to Night Fiction, where the realms of imagination come alive after dark. I'm your guide through a labyrinth of captivating stories, thrilling narratives, and mysterious adventures. Join me under the starry digital sky as we explore the enchanting world of night fiction together. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let the journey into the night begin. Izuku goes to high school, qualifying for UA's management course. His friends are in heroics, Ochako, support, Mei, and general studies, Hitoshi. While Izuku focuses on his studies, Tamura is acting on his father's behalf. Ochako is in class 1B. Izuku knows he has to make a decision, but since he's worrying about it, he has Hitoshi brainwash him into relaxing about it. Things go well, with Tamura instigating the USJ and the attack on the summer camp. There, things start to go wrong. Himiko recognizes Ochako by the dragon scale she has, and doesn't hurt Ochako. Unfortunately, one of the other students sees that, and this shifts suspicion to Ochako. When Kamino happens, and the rescue mission goes ahead, led by Momo, Ochako is the one student expelled. This angers Izuku, who decides to show Ua what fairness is by challenging the students who got kidnapped, Katsuki and Shoto. And those on the rescue team, Momo, Denki, Tenya, Honanuki and Kirishima. When they show up to Izuku's challenge, he pounds them all into the ground and steals their quirks before running from All Might. Izuku stays with Garaki for a few days, learning about the Nomu, what they really are, and finding out that Yakuni has been sent to the Shi Hasaikai. When Izuku is put back in contact with Tamura, the first thing he notices is that Tamura has All for One. Angry, Izuku attacks and kills Tamura, strangling him in the way that Tamura said he'd never use Kali Imperium. Izuku grabs all the quirks Tamura has, before he dies, leaving Tamura to die with decay. The League watched Dragon kill their leader, but the revelation that Dragon is a teenager is too much for some of them and they leave. For the others, they agree they'll make a decision after Izuku leads them on a mission. He doesn't know what mission to lead them in. Dabi asks for a different price. Dabi asks for Izuku to return Shoto's quirk. Izuku does this, earning Dabi's loyalty. Since Izuku wants the League to see him as a true leader, he knows he has to learn more about villainy, specifically the bigger crimes, like murder. Himiko volunteers to help him and they find a target he can kill. The principal of the school where he was attacked and got a broken rib. But also this was the principal who made the report that Night Eye found, which led All Might to All for One. Izuku goes and kills the principal in cold blood, thus proving to the League that he's not just going to use them to keep his hands clean. Meanwhile, a vigilante decides that Ochako is a villain lover and targets her. He managed to gather a group of like-minded people and they attack Ochako, putting her into a coma. When Izuku finds out, he's very angry. However, the police, backed by All Might, moved fast and arrested most of the group. Izuku has his mission for the League, and they raid the holding cells, getting most of the group, except for the vigilante. Izuku puts out a bounty on him and eventually someone comes forward. At about the same time, All Might finds out where the vigilante is. Izuku and All Might confront each other again, and after a brief fight, Izuku is again forced to flee and escapes, leaving the vigilante to All Might. Izuku meets Mei and Hitoshi in Ochako's hospital room, where they promise that while they might go their separate ways, they will remain friends. The Emperor's Dragon 1 Toshinori Yagi sat in Nezu's office. The rat hadn't been the principal when he'd attended, but there was something about the office that made him feel like a nervous teen, even if he was the #1 hero. The principal was reading his proposal. Toshinori knew it was a lie. Nezu would have already read it several times, and probably corrected the grammar, spelling, and formatting. Then he would have critically analyzed it and come to a decision. Even so, he'd make him believe he'd only read it now. Nezu put the paper down and looked at him. He tapped one finger on his desk. "You believe he's that formidable?" All Might nodded. He'd already submitted his report to the Hero Public Safety Commission. He wasn't sure what they'd think of it. They probably thought he was being paranoid, but he discussed it with Mirai and, with All for One, his course of action was simple. Hunt down the man's network until he got to him. Then destroy him. With his son, it wasn't going to be that simple. Izuku had no network to speak of. He'd be building it. While that should make the job easier, Yagi knew it wasn't going to be that way. Izuku would inherit the last of his father's lieutenants and they'd keep him from making any blatant mistakes. And he seemed to be intelligent. What he didn't have in experience, he'd make up for in strength and his quirk. "Did you see?" The way Nezu cocked his head told Toshinori what he meant. "I didn't see any evidence of their quirks," Yagi replied. He wasn't sure what that meant. Izuku had taken several quirks before he'd run from Ua and they were good quirks. He should have a rudimentary understanding of how they worked. Has he passed them on? The principal mused. That was a possibility. There were enough quirkless people out there, who would do anything for a quirk. And for the quirks of those who had been in the hero course, those who received them would no doubt swear loyalty to Izuku. They would be found, of course. The quirks Izuku had stolen were well known: explosion, engine, electrification, hardening, half-cold half-hot, and creation. Anyone who received them couldn't use the quirk without giving away who it came from, but they wouldn't be able to give it back. And what the hell would they be charged with? The usual charge would be possession of stolen items. Except a quirk was not defined as a possession. It was meant to be a part of the person. They could perhaps charge anyone who had those quirks with association with a villain, but the charge would stick, but it didn't do anything. It simply told those who were quirkless that there was someone out there who could give them a quirk. And those who ended up with the quirks were victims as well. I don't know, Toshinori said, finally. He might be keeping them for some other reason. Nezu's nose twitched and Toshinori wasn't sure what that meant. So you want to try this? The principal questioned. He nodded. You haven't found anyone you like? Nezu pressed. All Might sighed. Mirai had asked him that same question. The difference between the two was that Mirai had a candidate in mind to inherit One for All. If Nezu did, then the principal hadn't given so much as a hint as to who it could be. There were several I thought could be suitable. Could be? Nezu prompted. The rat was a stickler for meaning. Mirio is Sir Night Eye's preference. Toshinori didn't answer directly. He is a fine young man, and he will be a great hero, but he just didn't feel right. I am not sure he has the necessary. He paused and sighed again. If All for One was gone, then I wouldn't hesitate. I give One for All to Mirio, but he's not, and his son is still out there. Ah, Nezu murmured. There is a certain callousness required, he said. Yagi nodded. That was it exactly. Mirio was going to be a great hero, but right now, he didn't have the hardness that would be required to hunt down All for One's son, and Tamura Shigaraki. He might gain that hardness, and in the hunt, he'd have to, but if they could do this quickly, then there would be no need to have him learn that. Not if someone else was more suitable. I was thinking Kirishima as well, but it's the same. Nezu nodded his understanding. That won't have changed? It might have, Yagi allowed. Having their quirks stolen would have changed them all. Ah, so that's why you included them all, Nezu murmured. All the first years who had their quirks stolen had been on All Might's list of students he wanted for his venture. I am certain that Bakugo has the fortitude, but I'm not sure he has the restraint, All Might said honestly. Nezu cocked his head slightly, indicating he agreed with the assessment. But being without his quirk? The rat suggested. May give him the push he needs to grow, Toshinori agreed. But that's also why I want to see others, he explained. With All for One's son and successor out there, whoever receives One for All must be ready to deal with them. I can't limit my choice, not now. So why not mount an assault and capture him? Nezu asked, leaving out the fact that they didn't know where Izuku was. At some point, they would know. Why risk the next generation? This was something All Might had considered. The answer had surprised him. Gang Orca, Mount Lady, Best Jeanist, and Tiger encountered All for One, he said solemnly. Nezu nodded. They still have their quirks, even though he touched Best Jeanist. The principal caught the implications immediately. Interesting, he murmured, thinking hard. I wonder if it has to do with the time he was raised. Principal? Toshinori asked. You've told me that All for One is old, and therefore he was raised in a different time, one that had different expectations. He would have needed to be circumspect in using his quirk, and maybe that has rubbed off. He shook his head emphatically. If All for One likes a quirk, he takes it, he said. Then perhaps he did not like them. Nezu suggested the obvious. Or is there some other limitation on his quirk? I don't know, All Might admitted. Gran? He sighed heavily. Gran probably would have known, but Gran was dead. When All for One had forced Tamura Shigaraki to escape, Gran had been thrown through the portal as well. He hadn't survived. There might be a limitation, but if there is, Izuku's quirk does not seem to share it, and so I believe people would hesitate. He gave the assessment honestly. The principal gestured to indicate that was a reasonable assessment. And the children won't, they haven't learned that they aren't invincible yet, the rat mused. I don't want to use that against them, Toshinori objected. Except he knew he was. But because they have seen what Izuku has done to their peers, they could see it happening to themselves, but they will also be more driven to deal with him. To do that, I believe we are going to need more than just UA students. This isn't a problem for UA, it's a problem for all heroes. Nezu thought about that for a moment, but All Might knew he was thinking of other issues. And the divisions between the schools are holding us back, he said. Toshinori looked slightly sheepish but nodded. We can't afford to be divided on anything because he will exploit that. If he doesn't, one of his lieutenants will. All Might sighed. I hope I'm being paranoid. I really hope, that all the preparation isn't needed, but he remembered chasing All for One. Ferreting out each piece of information and striking when he found All for One's network. He remembered, far too many times, when he'd been too late to act. It took him over 30 years to find All for One. If it took that long this time. They couldn't let Izuku be free for that long. Nezu thought for a while longer. The silence stretched between them until finally, the rat nodded. I'll support it, he said. Yagi felt himself relax. He hadn't been aware of how tense he'd been about the decision until the stress disappeared. With Nezu backing his idea, while it wasn't guaranteed to be accepted, it had far more chance of succeeding. As the number one hero, his promotion of the idea would help, but having the number one hero school backing it as well would be beneficial. How many students from each school? Nezu asked, immediately moving into practicalities. His idea was to gather the top hero students from each facility in Japan, to have them train together. Izuku and Tamura represented a new wave of villains, and rather than just wait for them to strike, Toshinori wanted to be on the front foot. It would also help to regain public trust in UA and heroes in general. The new heroes would form the bulwark to guard society. Just their best 2 or 3 from any year level, Toshinori replied immediately. They were heading into the second half of the first year. The teachers would have an idea of who was going to be great, even at this early stage. I want to offer a place to all the rescue squad, he added. Even though Izuku took their quirk. Darn it, All Might stopped himself. He was thinking of them only as their quirk, which was one of the problems Izuku had pointed out with society. He had to stop that. They were people, not their quirk. It will be harder for them, Nezu noted. They have the most to gain, Yagi countered. It might sound arrogant, but it was true. Will you retire now or when you pass on One for All? That was a question Toshinori didn't like. He wanted to retire now, while it could be seen as a benefit, a triumph, but the commission was afraid of what would happen and what signal that would send to villains. They thought his retirement would embolden them. He thought they were already emboldened by Tamura and Izuku's very public actions. All for One had apparently kept some of them under control. It was rather disconcerting to know that. When we begin, he indicated, I will retire to devote my full attention to teaching. The principal nodded. It was a fair compromise, and while the public would be dismayed, they would be pleased to know that All Might was teaching the next generation. Endeavor would not be happy, but ever since he found out about All Might's injuries, nothing had made him happy. He wanted to gain the top spot against an All Might who was at full strength, and he knew that was never going to happen. Whether he knew it or not, it hadn't been going to happen for the last few years. In that manner, Endeavor had a surprisingly fair streak, though it was more likely he wanted absolutely no question about his right to the number one position when he took it. All Might retiring was not how he wished to claim it. It will take some time to set up, Nezu indicated. This is a high school initiative, Yagi replied, showing his understanding. They could probably set it up within a week, if they accepted the commission overseeing and wanting control over everything. Technically that was their job, just not to the level they were. In recent years, they had become far more authoritative, going into areas they had previously let regulate themselves. I'll keep you informed, Nezu said, waving one paw. This might be Yagi's proposal, but it would be Ua who made it work. And while he did think the number one hero was being slightly paranoid, he had learned that it was better to be safe than sorry, especially with new villains. They could be so unpredictable, and with Izuku, unpredictable could be truly dangerous. The principal was also disappointed. He looked at Izuku's grades, and while the teen was not a genius, he definitely didn't think like the other students. It might be the influence of his father, but he couldn't help but feel he could have had a few interesting conversations with the teen. Finding someone who had a genuinely different view of the world and the arguments to back it up was rare. The opportunity had been lost. Izuku's father probably had similar views, but he was in Tartarus. That was such a waste. Ted Overhaul rolled the vial between his fingers. The liquid inside was clear, but to his eyes seemed blue. That was the effect of the vial. In his other hand he held a case. It held a series of vials and a space for a larger tube. The vial spaces were filled, with each vial being a successive shade of darker blue, nestled in the black velvet lining. The tube space was empty. He looked to chronostasis and askance. The serum still needs some work, he explained, but the bullets? Chronostasis nodded and Kai felt a smile cross his features. They were getting closer. The new guy, the one who used to be loyal to All for One, had been a great help. While quirkless, he actually had some lab training, which meant he had refined some of their processes. What's the time on each of the bullets? He asked, pointing to the vials. The new guy insisted that it varies, but a day, a week, 2 weeks, and then permanent. He says he can probably mix up a month if wanted, Chronostasis said. I'll keep that in mind, Kai said, putting back the light-colored vial and pulling out the darkest one. They'd need a better color coding system for them. The permanent ones would have to be red. Something to indicate that they were permanent. He held the vial up to the light. The liquid reflected the light but did nothing more. He smiled. The weapon was nearly ready, and once it was. It wouldn't matter if All for One returned. It wouldn't matter what Dragon said, it would be the Shi Hasaikai who were in control. He'd sell the first bullets cheap, just to prove that they worked. He doubted they'd be used on anyone important. So the serum would also be cheap. And he'd be able to make use of the temporary bullets as well. They would be his proof of concept sales. Once everyone knew it worked, he'd let it be known he had permanent bullets. Then he'd watch the villains scramble to get them, and the heroes would be frantic to pay him off. They'd want to arrest him. He wasn't stupid. But they wouldn't be able to. Not when arresting him meant that they would be permanently without their quirks. In some way, he really should thank that Ua student. All for One's son. He'd established the thought that quirks could be taken. Now he would capitalize on the idea. He put the vial back and snapped the case closed. Get the permanent bullets cased in red, Kai ordered. They'd need that visual delineation. I'll go work on the serum, he added. And, get me 3 permanent bullets. 3? Chronostasis said the number as confirmation, but Kai knew he was curious as to who they were for. He held up the case. This is going to make everyone realize the Yakuza were never gone, Kai reminded him. But to ensure we remain at the top. Ah, there's a few that must be removed, Chronostasis finished for him. Kai nodded. All for One was in Tartarus, and while no one had ever escaped, then there was Tamura Shigaraki and All for One's son. They were the two who would most likely be on the receiving end of these bullets, and unless they were very, very nice. All for One's time was over. It was the Shi Hasaikai's time to rule. They'd acknowledge that. One way or another, the Emperor's Dragon. Dragon 2 establishment. Izuku looked around the bar Kurogiri had found for them to move into. He gave the Misty Man a rather ironic smile. It seemed familiar. You like bars, he commented. They are useful spaces, the warp gate defended. Izuku laughed. It's fine, he dismissed the need to be defensive. Is there enough space here? It used to be a hostel, so there is room upstairs, Kurogiri told him, pointing to a very narrow set of stairs coming off from a corner. They disappeared into darkness. Then let's set up here, he decided. They'd been living in a warehouse for the last few weeks. It was one where Yakuni appeared to be copying quirks. Warehouses had some advantages when you were hiding from the authorities. There were lots of them being one of the key advantages, but they had some really big disadvantages when people couldn't go anywhere. There was no privacy. Facilities were rudimentary, and being large, open spaces, they were freezing in winter, and stiflingly hot in summer. The cold could be dealt with by extra blankets, but they were not comfortable. This would be much better. Each of his companions, the villains who had been gathered to aid Tamura, could have their own space, but they would still be living together and hopefully learning to work together. He was going to have to make sure that was something they practiced. But that was an issue for tomorrow. First, they had to move in and then plan. I will need stock, Kurogiri announced, walking to the bar. There were a few, very dusty glasses, on the wall behind it, but no alcohol. Izuku asked. Yellow eyes turned to him. The main risk with the warehouse is people coming and going when people are not meant to be there. It is the same here. We will need customers to ensure that we blend, he explained. Izuku nodded. That made sense. He'd never thought about it growing up, but it made a lot of sense. Will there be enough passing traffic? He asked. The Misty Man nodded. This is not the best neighborhood, he observed. At that, Izuku snorted lightly. There were so many conclusions that could be drawn from that statement, but the one that was important to him was firmly rooted in the socio-economic class of the neighborhood. Upmarket neighborhoods tended to get more hero activity. The central business district and shopping areas were awash with heroes, especially during times when the public was present. They had a reasonable amount of hero presence in the downtimes too. But neighborhoods like this one didn't see as much activity. They might see new heroes or underground heroes. That could be their biggest threat actually. Underground heroes tended to actually want to be heroes, and it had been a threat all his life, Izuku realized. He'd have to deal with it when something materialized. He looked around. Would it damage anything if I blow the dust out? He asked. Kurogiri gave him an odd look before he understood what he was asking. He then moved behind the bar, took the non-broken glasses down, and secured them, before moving to a side door. From the angle, Izuku knew it went into an alleyway. It was probably the emergency fire exit. Then Kurogiri moved to stand next to him. It should be okay now, he indicated unnecessarily. Izuku grinned and focused. Kali Imperium wasn't actually a wind quirk, but he could give that impression. It allowed him to manipulate nitrogen. He couldn't change the chemical composition, so he couldn't change the nitrogen in the air into ammonia or something like that. But he could make the nitrogen in the air act as a physical barrier. That was often good enough for his purposes. So now, he concentrated on brushing the nitrogen in the air over the bar surfaces, picking up the dust, and throwing it out the door. It took a few minutes, but already the place looked cleaner, even if it now smelled extra musty. "What's upstairs like?" Izuku asked. "It's not too bad," Kurogiri replied. "It hasn't been abandoned long." That was good. They could clear up the beds and use the rooms. He'd get in furniture if he needed, but the budget was better without that need. It was a good thing he'd had a bit of experience living by himself to get used to budgeting. "We should probably get some food before moving everyone over," Izuku mused. Kurogiri nodded. "I'll get it," Izuku said. "If you can move them over?" he added. The Misty Man nodded again and closed the outside door. "There's a shop down the road," he said, and there was something in his tone that took Izuku by surprise. He gave the warp gate a sharp look. "Just make sure you don't offend them," Kurogiri advised. For a moment Izuku didn't understand, but then he nodded. The store was probably one of the hubs of the local community. For them to pass unnoticed, they had to fit in with them. He reached up and roughed up his hair a little as he changed it to a black color. It would be nice if the color change quirk also included length and style, but it was just color. He let his eyes turn brown. "I'll be nice," he reassured the warp gate as he went to the front door and slipped out. They needed this base, so he wasn't going to make mistakes, and if they did it right. Izuku let a small smile play around his features. If they did this right, they could come to be seen as the neighborhood protectors. And that would be a great advantage. It wouldn't guarantee people didn't sell them out, but it would help. He'd be nice now. He'd be really nice now. It was hard to be casual when one of the checkout ladies was staring at him. Izuku had gotten to the store, picked out a trolley, and then started getting the stuff they'd need when he noticed her staring. She was doing her job, but she was staring at him intensely every time he came down to that end of the small shop. It was disconcerting. He didn't sense any hostility from her, just intense curiosity. He shook his head and kept shopping. It was kind of relaxing. This was a problem that was easily solved. He went for cheaper things that he could get in bulk and was thankful that he had a strength quirk that would help him carry everything. Eventually though, it came time to check out and Izuku deliberately went to the cashier lady who was staring at him. Thankfully she didn't let the fact that she was staring impact her job, but halfway through putting the groceries through, she smiled at him. "It is you," she said softly. Izuku braced. He wasn't used to being wanted, but he knew when she said that she could be referring to anything. His picture had been well circulated thanks to the Yayorozus. He gave her a quizzical look. She seemed to understand what it meant because she chuckled, and reached towards the fruit he'd put at the back of the conveyor belt. "I don't care about Ua," she told him conversationally. "I just want to thank you," she said, holding up the bag of mandarins. That jolted his memory and Izuku felt his eyes go wide. "You're okay," he said with a smile as he remembered her. She was the lady he'd helped in the alley, though he'd done practically nothing. He'd simply directed her to a shelter and given her some mandarins. She smiled back, looking far more peaceful than the last time he'd seen her. "I am," she confirmed. "You remembered me from that?" Izuku asked. All he'd done was give her some fruit and the location of the shelter. That was hardly anything. He looked at her name tag. It said Kamoni. Izuku got the impression she was biting her lip as she looked at him. Her eyes went watery. "It might have been nothing to you," she told him in a voice that trembled. "It was everything to me." He wasn't sure what to say to that. Eventually he settled on something neutral, so it worked out. Kamoni nodded, as she kept putting his groceries through. "Yes, now I have this job and," she smiled. It seemed satisfied. "Things are looking up." "I'm glad to hear it," he replied. "And for you?" Kamoni asked, giving him a look that said she wasn't asking about his legitimate interests. She was aware he was wanted and he only hoped she didn't plan to sell him out. He should run. He should do something, but Izuku realized he'd just have to wait to find out what happened. Right now he had no idea who he could trust. He shook his head in a way that indicated his uncertainty. Kamoni chuckled as she packed the last of the groceries into a bag. "Could go either way?" she interpreted his gesture. "Could go either way," Izuku confirmed, tapping his phone to the paypoint. "Well, if you ever need something," she told him. I may not be able to do much, but I owe you, Izuku, so if you need something, I will try. He just stared at her for a few moments, trying to work out what she was saying before he nodded. He had no idea what he could possibly need from her, but it was better to have allies than enemies. He started and then huffed. Again Izuku stopped, trying to collect his thoughts. I'm not sure what, he said finally, with a friendly nod, but I will keep it in mind. Kamoni grinned at him and nodded before she turned to the next customer. Izuku took that as his cue to leave, wheeling the trolley out and picking up all the bags before he shoved the trolley into the rack and headed back to the bar. It had been an interesting encounter, and while Kamoni said she'd help him because he'd helped her, if her view was even halfway indicative of the public's then, he had more support than he thought, and that was useful. Ted, got food, Izuku announced as he came through the door and noticed the group was gathered in the bar. He held up the bags that without his strength quirks, even with all his training he'd have been struggling to carry. Izu, Himiko cried happily and skipped over to him. You paid for it? Whisper asked, almost too softly to be heard. I paid for it, he confirmed for her. I don't want to antagonize our neighbors, he explained. He was pleased to see nods from the others, and Whisper gave him a smile that indicated she'd been fishing for the answer. Let me put this away and then I think it's time for a proper chat, he announced. There was some curiosity about that, but Izuku held firm as he moved to the kitchen. It wasn't a domestic kitchen but one attached to the bar, that would have served snacks and serviced the hostel rooms. The fridge was built in and was still in reasonable condition. Kurogiri had turned it on. He quickly unpacked the food and, after picking out some snacks, went back to the bar. Given that they just opened, there was no one there but his crew. You want to talk? You don't want to talk, Twice said. I want to talk, Izuku said seriously. What do you want to talk about? Dabi asked. What we are going to do. That got their attention. Izuku tossed the snacks onto the table as he took a seat. What are we going to do, Izu? Himiko asked. She grabbed a packet of chips and sat down too. The food gathered the others, and they picked out something to eat. Izuku sighed. It's easy to say I want to change the world, or I want to get rid of heroes, Izuku began. The question is, where do you start? He let that hover in the air for a bit. Izuku looked around. They were watching him with varying degrees of interest. Tamura was never meant to be alone, Izuku told them. Or rather, his part in the plan was to agitate society, while others took advantage of the discontent to change things. What do you mean, change things? Mr. Compress asked. He sounded intrigued. What's the easiest way of getting rid of heroes? Izuku challenged. Killing them, Himiko answered. That's one way, but it's kind of slow, Izuku answered, giving her a nod. Any other ways? It has always been one of the fundamental flaws of villainy, Mr. Compress mused. We tend to focus on one particular passion at a time. Hey, Himiko objected. I just want the blood. There does tend to be a few types of what society calls villain, Izuku agreed. There always has been, even when the word was simply criminal. He sighed and looked up at the ceiling. It was just a ceiling with a fan to move the air. There are those who steal because they have to steal to eat, and there are those who steal because they find it fun or profitable. There are those who are called villains because they have had no choice, those who live in their passions, and those who want to achieve something. The first aren't really villains. It is simply due to circumstance, but society doesn't care about that. The second, he half shook his head, indicating that it was a complex situation. They could probably live in a more accepting society. And the third, those are the rare type, Izuku concluded. You want to be that, you don't want to be that, Twice observed. I want to be that, Izuku confirmed. Which means I need to be honest with you and realistic about my chances. And then, when realistic, work out ways of being better. They thought about that for a while before Twice gave him a sharp look and pulled off his mask. So what exactly do you want? He asked pointedly. Izuku nodded to acknowledge the question. I want society to realize that heroes are not a benefit. That they are a self-perpetuating system that creates inequality, false prejudice, and class division. So write some papers, letters to the editor, Twice advised. Izuku grinned at the suggestion. I would if it changed anything. All that would do is gauge public opinion, which will be necessary, he allowed. Go into politics, Dabi suggested. I'm a little too young, Izuku countered. Though I had thought of that, he told the group. The Hero Public Safety Commission is, as the name suggests, a commission. It was set up by an act of parliament and is governed by that same act, he explained. If you want to change what they are doing, you just have to get parliament to agree to an amendment. While the looks he got for that information weren't blank, they weren't entirely believing either. I never said that would be easy, Izuku defended. At that, Dobby snorted, as if he'd made a joke. I don't think any of us have the temperament required to go into politics, Izuku told them with a wry grin. But it's something to consider. We haven't seen many retired heroes go into politics, but it used to be popular for retired sports stars, he explained. So you want a contact in parliament? Mr. Compress asked. I wouldn't say no, Izuku replied. There are other ways of making society change, he continued. Changing the act is the legal way, and there are 2 more ways I can think of. What are they? Whisper prompted when he fell silent. If you don't have someone in parliament, you have to make society want the change so that parliament does it anyway, Izuku said. That's what Tamura had been doing. Showing that heroes were ineffectual, and once people start thinking that, they start looking for their own protection. That's good in one way, but bad in others. If the government is decent, before it gets too far, they will address the citizens' concerns. No government is that good, Twice told him. Some have been, Izuku replied, giving him an ironic smile and shrugging. But I'm not sure ours is, which leaves us with the 3rd way of making a change. Izuku looked around. Atsuhiro gave him a mocking smile and Himiko giggled. He thought they knew what he was talking about. Dobby frowned and Twice looked intrigued while Whisper was thinking. Hostile takeover, Izuku announced, ignoring the drama inherent in the words. A coup? A coup, Izuku agreed. There's a couple of ways of doing them too. If parliament won't change, and society supports you, then it should be pretty easy. It's what comes after that is difficult. And if parliament and society are against you, then you just need more force. They've all been done in the past. Which way do you want, Izu? Himiko asked. I'd prefer with the support of society, Izuku told them. It's easier, and you have more tolerance when you make changes afterwards. But you'll use force if you have to, Dobby suggested. I will, Izuku agreed. But that could be akin to a civil war. Japan had fought several civil wars over its history and no one really wanted to repeat them. Though maybe there will be opportunities to be more creative. Twice frowned. What do you mean? I don't really want to instigate or fight a civil war, Izuku said. It would leave Japan weakened, and there are those who'd take advantage of that. But maybe we could create a separate society, he suggested with a shrug, but even as he said it he realized something. What is it? Himiko asked, seeing his change in expression. I might be thinking about this in the wrong way, Izuku said slowly. While society has some issues, they are perpetuated by heroes. Yes, we know that. Heroes are the problem, Himiko told him. Yes, they are a problem, but if we try to attack all of society, then all of society will be against us, Izuku said. We don't want that, he said with a self-deprecating chuckle. The fastest way to get the public offside is to look like you are going to take away their comfortable life. If that was the threat, then everyone would be against us. I don't want that. What I think we all really want is heroes gone, and with them, the support structure. You want to kill the support industry? Mr. Compress asked. No, I want the commission, Izuku corrected. I don't have a problem with social services, the tax commission, finance, foreign affairs, and all those, he explained, listing off parts of the government. It's really only the Hero Public Safety Commission which is the issue, and heroes. So, that means we must ensure we are targeted in what we do. We have to make sure the public knows we aren't against them. We are against those who claim to have their best interests at heart, those who claim to be for their safety, but who really don't care, so long as they get their action shot or their good propaganda. We have to show that heroes and the commission aren't needed, are corrupt, obsolete, whatever works, he finished with a grin. The group was silent again, understanding what he was saying. Finally, Dobby sighed heavily. Well, that's going to be the trick then, right? Making sure we pick our targets, he elaborated. Yeah, Izuku agreed with a huff. So, anyone know how to do that? He looked around. There was silence once again. This was going to be hard. The Emperor's Dragon 3 quirkless heroes. We could just attack the commission buildings, Twice suggested into the silence. That's got some possibilities, Dobby agreed, a little too eagerly. It does, but we'd have to do it in such a way we weren't declared terrorists, Izuku said, but he was nodding. In fact, we could do it as a couple of attacks. A warning and then something harder. The only thing is, I don't think attacking the commission building will actually do anything. The symbolism, Mr. Compress told him. That would be powerful, Izuku admitted. I think it would make an even greater impression if we announced it first. If the heroes can't protect what is essentially their central headquarters, then how can they protect anyone else? He asked rhetorically. He thought about it for a few more minutes, though would it be enough? Izuku asked. What do you mean? I don't think just attacking their headquarters will be enough to get the message across. It should be obvious though. If you need a commission to ensure public safety from something, Then doesn't that suggest that something is doing it wrong? That got him a chuckle. It has to be more widespread, Izuku considered sadly. The wider a conflict, the more innocent people got dragged into it, but, on the other hand, people needed to be involved to make sure things changed. It was a delicate balance. We could attack Parliament? I think that would get us called terrorists, Izuku countered. But it might be something we do in time, he allowed as he looked around. Before considering that though, I think we have a bigger issue. Really? Himiko asked. Izuku nodded. He pointed at Dabi and moved his finger around as he counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, Izuku said, pointing at himself. Plus a few, he acknowledged. I have no doubt we can take out a lot of heroes, but I want to see what comes after. Twice's quirk will help, but, he shrugged, the problem was obvious. We need more manpower, Mr. Compress said as Izuku gave him a nod. Izuku was watching the group so he saw the consideration on Twice's face. I may be able to help with that, the man indicated. Not with my quirk, he clarified. Izuku gestured that he should continue, before handing the last of his snacks to Himiko when she looked at them. He gave her a smile. Just having her here was helping. How much do you know about the Yakuza? Twice asked. Didn't they die out in the pre-quirk era? Whisper asked. Mostly, Twice said, but they are still around. So, they can't be doing anything or the heroes would have got them, Dabi muttered. Probably not, Mr. Compress agreed. But they are people who would most likely want to see heroes gone, he added. Do you know any of them? Twice nodded. It's definitely worth meeting them, Izuku decided. Can you get in touch with them and organize a meeting? He asked. Again the blonde nodded. Thank you, Izuku said. There's one other thing I would like you all to think about, he added, looking around. What is it, Izu? You all have versatile quirks and you know how to use them to best effect, but if we are going to take on the Hero Public Safety Commission and all the top heroes, then we are going to need to be flexible with the way we use them. And, there are weaknesses with every quirk. Not yours. Dabi said. Mine has weaknesses, Izuku countered. It takes energy to use a quirk, he explained. And everyone can train themselves to use their quirk so that it seems as if they don't get tired but they are still using energy. If I use multiple quirks then I'm using the energy equivalent to that. And I don't have any energy stockpile quirks, so I get tired quickly. It was perhaps a mistake to tell them his weakness, but being vulnerable was a part of how you built trust. What are you saying? Twice demanded. I want you to think of ways to counter your weaknesses, Izuku told him. With a quirk? Dabi asked. With a quirk, Izuku confirmed, but silently he was also advocating for support equipment. It would be a test to see if they'd think of that. Quirks weren't everything in this world. He'd learned that well. If we can find a single quirk which would counter your weaknesses, then if you are willing, I am willing to have you acquire that quirk, he told them. That won't help us, Whisper objected. Taking a quirk from someone will make them hate us, she explained. They can be copied, without the original owner knowing, Izuku explained, but the act of talking about this reminded him of something Dr. Garaki had said. His father had collected quirks for him to use, but the doctor had never given them to him. Izuku had no doubt those quirks would help him, and if he was to go forward with any plan, then he'd need those quirks. Oh, there was some surprise. Think about it, Izuku advised them. It's not compulsory, but it could be an option. Dabi looked thoughtful. It is something to think about, he agreed. That's all I can ask, Izuku said as he got up. While it's early, my sleep has been mucked up, so I am going to take advantage of the quiet and sleep, he told them all. There were various nods and some agreement. They hadn't been sleeping well in the warehouse and the opportunity to sleep in private was going to be appreciated tonight. Toru Hakagor had been so happy to get into UA. She'd worked her behind off in the last year of middle school studying and making sure she could pass the entrance exam. She'd prepared as best as she could for the physical part of the exam and somehow, she'd passed and gotten into Class 1A. For about 4 hours, it had taken her that long to be expelled. That had hurt. She'd done her best on the physical tests, and she'd know she had to get stronger, but wasn't that what she was at UA for? She'd tried to have some camaraderie with Mineta, who had been expelled with her, but the bastard had told her he wasn't interested 'cause he couldn't see her tits. It was the smallest consolation that she'd done better than that prick. But she had still been expelled, and being expelled from UA pretty much meant no other hero school would take you. Her parents had managed to get her into high school as a late entry, but it was hard. It was so hard going. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. She'd tried to explain that her teacher had expected something she couldn't provide, but everyone listened and said the right things, that he'd done it before. That Aizawa was known for that, and that she wouldn't be the last, but she knew about the way people said things without actually saying them. And since no one knew exactly where she was looking, she saw the looks people gave her when, well, they couldn't know she wasn't looking but when they thought she shouldn't be able to see them. The ones of contempt were easy to understand. The pitying ones were the worst. But that was going to change. While she had been expelled, she'd followed what the class had been doing. There had been so many things to follow and she'd been so scared for them at times. Now though. She clicked to YouTube again and pulled up the video. It was of Daiki Yaoyazoru's interview. She'd already watched it multiple times and it wasn't like he said anything directly applicable to her, but it was the impression. He was willing to work with Maite Kui to see to it that the teen wasn't prosecuted as a villain, so long as he gave the quirks back. No one had heard so much as a peep from Maite in the weeks following that interview, which meant there was an opportunity. Toru had no idea where Maite was, but she thought she might be able to find out. She couldn't turn her quirk off, so no one complained she was using it. But it meant she could use it to find out where Maite was and no one could accuse her of abusing her quirk. Taking advantage of it, yes, but illegal use, no. That wasn't really the point. The point was that no one knew where he was, but she could look. It was not going to be an easy task, but what else was she going to do? She went to school and did her homework, but that hardly took up all her time, and this. If she found Maite, or something that could lead to him, then, Toru licked her lips, she could ask for a reward, and while she'd like to ask to be re-enrolled in UA, she knew Aizawa would just expel her again, so instead, she'd ask for an enrollment in another hero school. She was going to be a hero. It was just going to take some negotiation and dedication on her part. Nothing worthwhile was easy, but she'd show Aizawa she was the perfect material for an underground hero when she found Maite, and by then, it would be too late. Her reputation would go to another school, but where to look first? Daiki had said it, Maite had a tie to the villain All Might had fought and that had been in a warehouse district. There were also rumors going around that the various monsters that had been appearing were artificially created. She didn't know much about that, but Toru figured you'd want space for that, so it made sense that the villain was in the warehouse district. And it was far better for her to search warehouses than bars. There were too many shady bars for her to realistically check, but warehouses, those she could check. So, that's what she was going to do, and when she found something. Toru smiled. She was pretty sure the HPSC would find her request reasonable. Ted Shoto sat and sipped his tea. He wasn't even aware that tea houses had private rooms, but Momo had told them to meet here. She'd invited everyone and they were sitting around the table in various states. Iida looked nervous, but he knew what to do in this setting, far better than Kaminari, Kirishima and Bakugo did. Though Bakugo was doing an admirable job of fitting in. He was surprising like that. At length, Momo put down her teacup and sighed softly. Shoto got the impression that there was some sort of expected social nicety that they had no idea about. "What do you think of the training opportunity?" she asked them. That explained the private room, though their notoriety was also attracting attention, so it could have been that. "It is interesting," Tenya said diplomatically. Nezu had extended their time off to adapt to the lack of their quirks, though the principal had insisted that they still attend class. The non-heroics won anyway. They couldn't fall too far behind. Then the principal had come to tell them that they could be included in some sort of inter-school training event. Except it wasn't an event, it was more like they were creating a special, dedicated course for up-and-coming heroes. The principal hadn't told them much. He didn't need to. They could think for themselves. It was obvious that the course was going to prepare them to fight Izuku Midoriya. "I'm going for it," Bakugo growled. "I'm gonna beat the shit out of that villain," he assured them. No one bothered to point out that his arm was still in plaster, and some other, very minor villains had beaten him up. One was still awaiting formal sentencing. Nor did they bother to point out that Izuku Midoriya had fought them all together, and still won. At least some of that was because he'd taken their quirks, but he wasn't an easy foe. Shoto looked at Kaminari and Kirishima, making it clear that he wouldn't object if they answered first. There were a lot of social niceties he wasn't aware of, but that was one he'd actually managed to perfect. And right now, he didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to tell someone he had his quirk back. He knew what it would look like. There was no way to escape the fact that it would look like he was now in league with Izuku Midoriya. This group might not immediately think that. Bakugo would probably want to know how it had happened, and then demand to know why he hadn't beaten up Izuku. The others. It was going to come out. Shoto knew that. He couldn't keep it a secret forever, but how did he tell people that he had his quirk back because someone else had paid the price? Who would believe that? He could also say it was because Izuku just decided to give it back, but that was even more unbelievable. "I'm not sure," Kirishima admitted, sounding reluctant. "It's a good opportunity, but," he swallowed and looked at Kaminari. "We're not sure how we can help with that, given what has happened." Because we're quirkless, Kirishima elaborated. I'm not going to be quirkless forever, Bakugo growled. Shoto got the impression he wanted to shout but knew better. I will be trying, Tenya said. I have to, he added. Your family? The tall teen nodded. To uphold the family tradition, I will go into heroics, Tenya told them. I may not be able to be a really well-ranked hero, but with the right support equipment, I can be a hero. I'm gonna be the best. You wanna be elite, Bakugo growled. Tenya ignored him. That's why I'm going to help on this activity, he said, referring to the event Nezu had told them of. If I can help bring in Izuku Midoriya then, he sighed but didn't finish. Shoto knew what he was going to say. If Tenya could do something, and get noticed bringing in Izuku Midoriya, then even though he still hadn't graduated, it would cement his reputation as a hero and that would establish his brand for another generation of Idas. What about you, Momo? Shoto asked. He still didn't want to say what he'd do. My parents have already suggested several roles within our companies, she said with a sigh. Shoto got the impression she wanted to say something else but felt that now wasn't the time. If you don't do this, what will you do? Momo asked Kirishima and Kaminari. I was going to go into general studies, Kaminari admitted. I don't think I'm smart enough to be a quirkless hero. You'd do fine, Momo tried to comfort him. No, go to general studies, Fuzzbrain. All of you go to general studies and just wait for me to get your quirks back. 'Cause it's not like you are going to get them back yourself. Does anyone know if Honanuki and Shoji have been invited? Shoto asked. Not yet, Momo told him, but Nezu said they will be. What about you? I will be going, he said. His father hadn't said anything about it, but Shoto knew what Endeavor would have said. It would have been along the lines of him needing to go show the other heroes what the future #1 hero looked like. Endeavor hadn't said anything because he still thought his quirk was with Izuku Midoriya. It was a difficult situation. Momo nodded. What do you think of the plan? The principal hadn't told them a plan but again, it was obvious. By bringing the best hero students from around the country together, they were going to make a fighting force. I just need my arm healed and I'll kill him. Shoto had known Momo for a while and so knew her expressions. She wasn't going to invite Bakugo next time, not if he was going to be unrealistic. I believe it is a good opportunity to develop contacts and bonds to use in professional life, Iida said. And it will be a way of, he sighed. There may be an opportunity to get our quirks back, he added. At that Kaminari and Kirishima looked up, as if they hadn't thought about that. That's true, Kirishima murmured. If the group encountered Izuku, and brought him in then, that could be a possibility. Shoto didn't think it was going to be that easy but, it was not for him to say. Yeah, that's true, Kirishima said louder and gave them a smile. I think I'll go with it then, he said. Me too, Kaminari said, with a note of hope in his voice. He still wasn't sure but, he'd be willing to try. Momo smiled. I'm glad to hear it, she said. It will be difficult but I think we can make a difference, she added. Shoto swallowed. Just so long as the difference they made wasn't as an object lesson to the others, then it would be okay, except. He really couldn't see how they'd help. Not in a meaningful way, not in a way they'd be satisfied with but, right at the moment, all they could do was try. The Emperor's Dragon 4 there will be questions. Stay a moment, Shoto asked Momo after the others had left. What is it? She asked. For a moment Shoto wanted to tell her everything but knew it would be too dangerous. Instead, he gathered his thoughts. What if there was a way to get your quirk back? He asked. What do you mean? He handed over his phone. On the messages he'd received, there was nothing in there to indicate the date he was meant to be at the park, except for the date it was sent. He watched as Momo read it. I'm sorry Shoto, she said finally, after flicking to the final message. It took him a moment to understand what she meant and then he realized she thought he'd gone to the meeting and no one had been there. He thought to correct her but the words didn't leave his mouth. Did your parents get anything similar? He asked instead. I can check, Momo promised him. Shoto nodded. How did they get your number? Momo asked. No idea, he told her. There must have been something in the way he said it because Momo gave him a sharp look. Shoto, that's just a scammer, isn't it? You didn't go? She asked worriedly. This wasn't going how he thought it might. He could lie but. I did, he admitted. And, Momo pressed. He fixed his eyes on her and raised his hands before letting a tiny flame dance on his left hand while forming an ice block on his right. Momo's eyes widened and she stared. Shoto watched as her eyes flicked between his hands, as if confirming that she really was seeing his quirk in use. How? What happened? Why didn't you tell anyone? Momo demanded. He let his quirk fade. I thought it was a scam, Shoto told her. He was surprised when her eyes suddenly became sad. Shoto, Momo whispered. "What did you promise him?" she asked, almost too gently. "Nothing," he said immediately. "I thought it was a scam, and they'd just demand money, or information or something." And then when whoever it was said they'd already convinced Dragon, Shoto shook his head as the words tumbled out of him. "Wait, who's Dragon?" Momo asked with a frown. "It says him there, but it didn't matter what name was there if the text had been a scam. The fact that he had his quirk back made the name important." While Momo's parents were rich, he sometimes forgot that they weren't heroes. There was information they just didn't know. "My dad's been talking about someone in the underworld for a while. Some guy named Dragon. Except no one knew who it was. Your friend, Uraraka." "What does Dragon have to do with her?" "She apparently has a pendant or something that was supposedly given to her by Dragon. During the camp, one of the villains recognized it, and left Uraraka alone." "What?" Momo demanded. "That's what I got told," Shoto defended. "Why weren't we told?" Momo bit her lip. "Does Ochako know her pendant came from a villain?" she worried. "I don't know," he replied. He really didn't know any of that detail. "It's just, Dad said they figured out who Dragon was recently." "No," Momo was quick on the uptake. All the hero students were. "So Maite is the traitor?" "I don't know," Shoto shook his head. "He was there though, with someone else. I don't know who. And he gave back my quirk." Momo took a deep breath and then looked at him. "You had to tell someone." "I know, but," he shook his head. "I didn't tell anyone at the time, because I was positive it was a scam. And then he just walks up and grabs my hand and it's back," Shoto said. "You have to tell someone. They can get information from it," Momo insisted. "I asked about other quirks," he said softly. That silenced Momo. She looked at him and he knew what she was thinking. She wanted to know what he'd said. He said he'd give them back if someone paid the price. "What price?" Momo whispered, as if she didn't want to know but Shoto knew she had to know. "Loyalty," he said simply. "Shoto?" Momo questioned him again. "I swear, I didn't," he promised her. "I don't know who did. But everyone will believe you did." He nodded. "That's why I don't know how to tell people." Momo sighed. "They can test what you were thinking," she said, waving one hand. "Test? There are people with lie detector quirks," she told him. "The police like them," she added. Oh, he felt stupid for not thinking about that possibility. He could prove that he hadn't done anything and then, "I'll talk to Aizawa," he assured her as he got up. "I'll talk to my parents," Momo said. No one is willing to be loyal to him but, maybe there is something that can be done to change his mind? The suggestion was hopeful. Shoto wasn't sure. He hoped they could capture Izuku and get back the other quirks but, he already knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Ted Aizawa looked at the scores and pursed his lips. At least the physical ability of the want-to-be hero they'd foisted upon him was no worse than those in his class. That was something. He wasn't one of those people who thought his quirk would get him everywhere. Aizawa looked at the boy through heavily lidded eyes. The kid was waiting for his assessment. He was silent and appeared to be patient. That was another point in his favor but the kid would need a lot of points to ever get out of the red. Shota understood why he was ordered to do this but no one said he had to like it. The kid was Izuku Midoriya's friend and he had no idea what the commission was thinking. No, he did know because he couldn't say he'd seen this before. This was a new play for them but it was so predictable that he knew exactly where it was going. What he really didn't understand was why the commission didn't just question the kid and leave it at that. They were questioning the kid, tomorrow, but they were still making him go through with training him. "All right, we will have to work on your physical abilities," Shota huffed and was inwardly pleased to see the kid nod. "Now, I don't have time to find out how your quirk works through observation, so tell me," he instructed. It would be a good test to see if the kid could be succinct in his description. He'd watched him at the sports festival but the teen hadn't had a lot of chances to show off his quirk. Aizawa was glad when the teen paused for a second, and he could see him rewriting what he had been about to say. That was good. He didn't need the sensationalist spiel that most quirks had. He wanted the realistic, fact-based one. "It's a conditionally activated quirk," the teen told him. "If you fulfill certain conditions, I can control your body," he explained the consequences. At that, Shota suddenly had a much better idea why the commission was doing this. "What are the conditions?" "You have to reply to something I said," the teen told him, looking down, though he quickly looked up. That gesture was telling. The teen had been bullied about his quirk but had gotten support. Aizawa had a horrible feeling that he knew who had provided the support. Then he realized something. Nomori had called the battle against Todoroki too early. If she'd let it continue, then Todoroki would have said something to the teen and would have walked out of the ring like Ojiro had and, well, it was possible when the ice melted the teen would have been unable to continue, or that he would have slid out of the ring making it a double elimination, but it was also possible he could have gotten out of the ice and been functional for the next round. No doubt Izuku Midoriya had pointed all of that out to his friend. The fact that the teen was still here was a good start. Anything else? Aizawa asked, pushing aside thoughts of the sports festival. He could see the way the teen was thinking. To most, it would seem as if his face was blank. To him, it was clear. They were going to have to work on his ability to lie. Just spit it out, he ordered. I can leave subliminal orders, the teen said quickly. Fuck. You are absolutely sure about that? The teen swallowed and then nodded. He at least knew how dangerous his ability was. Aizawa cursed some more in his mind. The Hero Public Safety Commission is questioning you about your friend tomorrow, aren't they? He asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, the kid said. Aizawa huffed. You absolutely cannot tell them about that, he said urgently. The teen looked at him and then huffed, so he was right. Who was? Shota asked before he realized there was only one person it could be. Thankfully the teen realized he had worked it out and didn't bother to say anything. It's difficult to explain, he said slowly. Your friend isn't stupid. He's foolish for being a villain, but he's not stupid. However, I do not believe the Hero Public Safety Commission would be of danger to you. Then what do you mean? Your friend probably told you that the commission would want to control you, and they'd do whatever it took to ensure they could control you? Aizawa made it a question. The teen nodded. It's not impossible, he had to admit, but I don't think it would happen, he reassured the kid with a sigh. The commission, though, is made up of powerful people. People who are convinced they are right. People who, he sighed again. People who will use any tool to maintain their power, the teen finished for him. Yes, Shota agreed. That's why I don't believe it would be the commission but someone either associated with them or, he shrugged. There were a lot of possibilities. The kid nodded his understanding and Shota actually believed he got it. They aren't meant to be asking about my quirk, he said. Just your friend, Aizawa replied somewhat sarcastically. Just Izuku. All right, he said softly. Do not volunteer any further information. Answer their questions honestly, but don't give them more than they ask for, he advised. The kid looked at him sharply before he nodded. I know you don't really want an apprentice, but, he paused, and Shota could tell he was trying to think of what to say. Thank you, the kid settled on those words. We have a lot of work to do before you can even consider entering a heroics class, he dismissed the thanks. And there is a fair chance you will have to fight your friend. The teen looked down. Yeah, I know, he said softly. Shota understood but had no idea what it would feel like. He'd never had a friend turn villain. Dead but not a villain. He felt like he should say something but the usual words, that even if it was difficult to take him in, that it was for his own good were hollow and it wasn't something the teen would want to hear now. Aizawa was surprised when the kid sighed. He made his choice, he murmured. I just wish he'd picked another way, the teen continued. For what? The teen stared at him, meeting his eyes squarely. There are things that the hero industry can do better, he said, but while the statement was one a teenager would make, the tone of his voice showed there was thought behind the statement. But this is not the way to make the world decide that, he added. You thought about it? We did, the kid admitted. And what did you want? Shota asked. Maybe it was just teenagers discussing things but it could give them insights into Izuku and what he would do to gain what he wanted. The teen thought about it for a moment. More accurate reporting on hero activities. What do you mean? At the moment, every fatality and injury gets blamed on the villain. That's not possible, he explained. Aizawa nodded. It wasn't quite the truth but it probably appeared that way. If it really was that way, then heroes wouldn't need insurance. A lot of the deaths and injuries are down to the villain, he said. And property damage is usually paid for by the hero's insurance, he pointed out. I know, the kid said reasonably, but the reports make it seem like everything is the villain's fault, which just puts heroes on a pedestal they can't possibly sustain. That was a better argument. Look, he's not against all heroes, the teen told him. Shota was surprised. The statement told him that the kid was aware he was fishing for information. He actually thinks underground heroes are pretty good, but, he shook his head. I don't know anymore. I thought I did. He didn't say anything more. Aizawa wasn't sure what to say. The kid would have to work it out for himself. Well, that's for tomorrow, he indicated. For now, give me 5 laps. If you are going to be a hero, then you are going to need to be fit. After that, we'll discuss support items. 5 laps of what? The kid asked. For a moment Shota was tempted to say Ua, but the kid would collapse. They'd have to work their way up to that. The training grounds, he said instead. The teen gave him a nod and heaved a sigh before he started. Well, not running but trotting. They'd work on that. Aizawa watched him go. He still didn't want to do this, but maybe it wouldn't be that bad. The kid, at least, seemed to be realistic and he could work with that. Ted Tartarus was an island. It was also one of the best defended places in the world, and its very design created walls, both physical and mental, to keep the prisoners it contained in. But what a lot of people forgot about Tartarus was that it was self-sufficient. It could lock itself away from the world for a minimum of 5 years without issue. Longer probably, but that had been considered enough. As such, as well as guards, there were other professionals working at Tartarus. Yoshisato was one. In another setting, he'd be a research and development specialist. At Tartarus, his job was to catalog and register the prisoners' personal belongings, and then put them in storage. If there was something useful in those belongings, then he registered that as well, and then the various groups in charge of Tartarus decided what to do with it. Usually, the HPSC took the lead, but not always. Since Tartarus prisoners didn't get released, his secondary job was maintaining the generators. These were not just stock standard diesel generators. They were a variety of clean energy sources and required some maintenance. Everyone in Tartarus was multi-skilled. He'd been skimping that maintenance for the last few weeks to examine the latest prisoner's gear. The mask the man had been brought in with was a thing of wonder, and Yoshisato could see it providing much-needed mobility to some people who desperately wanted it. The mask was laid out on the table before him. The protective armor plates were stacked in one corner and the other bits were displayed with almost anatomical precision. You had to do it that way if you wanted to be able to rebuild. On a screen behind the parts were the scanned diagrams of how everything went together. He could see several independent systems had been integrated into the helmet, and Yoshisato could see the ways they'd be useful to others. Probably not to heroes, or at least not active heroes, but some retired heroes would no doubt benefit from some of the systems. Millions of people could benefit from them. Diabetics could simply load up the drugs, and let the system monitor them and administer insulin as needed. Those who were otherwise healthy but required extra respiratory assistance could use the breathing apparatus. It was far more compact and powerful than what was on the market. So now all he had to do was register the individual parts, and then the various agencies who contributed to the upkeep of Tartarus could negotiate to use the plans in various projects and for profit. It wasn't their primary source of funding, but it added a nice little extra. He entered the first section into the patents database. It was part of the respirator unit. The system beeped at him. He frowned. It wasn't the beep of acceptance, but the deeper tone indicating an issue. Yoshisato looked at the screen. What the system was telling him the design was registered already. No, that wasn't possible. It had come off a villain. If anyone had a system like this, they would be revolutionizing the support industry, not. He scanned it again, and again the system gave him the warning. Yoshisato clicked for more information and frowned. According to the patents database, the system was registered to a company called MI Enterprises. He'd never heard of them, but he couldn't say that they didn't exist. The company details were filled out correctly, including their business registration number. He sighed. It was probably a shell company for the villain. But, sorting that out so he could register the respirator and other systems for official use was going to take some time. He was going to have to get legal involved. Tartarus' legal team was mostly involved with their special workplace arrangements and sometimes with prosecuting infringement notices on idiots who came too close, but they knew what they were doing. And they'd probably tell the HPSC, and then, Yoshisato groaned. Why did villains complicate things so much?